Good morning, everyone. Hope you had a nice weekend. Before we start, I wanted to call your attention to something in today's New York Times, if any of you have had a chance to look at it, or if not, if you try to get around to it today. I would encourage you to read the lead story in today's Times, because it does bear on an issue we've talked about in here a couple of times. The lead story is on the capture of this top Taliban commander in this operation that's underway in Afghanistan. And there's an interesting couple of paragraphs that begin at the bottom of just before the jump on page 1 and continue on to page 8, in which they talk about the process by which the New York Times learned about the capture of this guy and then withheld the information for a couple of days at the request of the U.S. military, or actually of the White House, which was concerned that if news of his capture got out, that it would cause other people to sort of clam up. They held it for long enough, and then they have an interesting explanation both for why they held it and for why they decided to release it when they did. It really bears very much on the discussion we had a couple weeks ago on national security implications of reporting and cooperating with the government on it. So if you have a chance, take a look at it. So for this week, I'd like to do something a little bit different than we've done so far in this course, which is instead of looking at individual ethical decisions and decision-making by journalists, reporters, and editors, I'd like to talk this week about the business of journalism and some of the ethical implications that go into journalism organizations and journalism companies as opposed to individual journalists. And so let me just say at the outset, you know, when you talk about a journalism company, most of them are corporations, there are, by definition, at least a couple of different sets of interests. There are the corporation's duties to its shareholders and the journalist and journalism's duties to its readers, and I will argue even to the Constitution itself. There are special obligations placed on journalism organizations by virtue of history and the Constitution, and that there are real consequences for failure in these areas. There can be reduced access to government, reduced oversight of public officials, and ultimately really an erosion of democracy itself, which are, by the way, the bases for the special protection that journalism has. So if in the course of pursuing corporate interests, we end up doing damage to journalistic interests, then we really do, I think, undermine the constitutional basis for the business itself. So to do this, I thought I would approach this by really tracing two areas. It's really talking about the confluence of speech and press rights as an integral part of American history, and then the rise of corporations as a changing aspect of American history and of American life. So let me begin then with what seemed to me to be the basics for that discussion. As I mentioned, most journalism organizations take the form of corporations. There are a few that are organized differently, particularly smaller ones, but for the most part, large news organizations are corporate entities. Most are public corporations, although some are not. The Tribune Company, for which I work, for instance, is not a publicly traded company these days. And so what is a corporation? Some of you will know this from other studies, I'm sure, but in essence, it is a legal entity of, consisting of people who are its shareholders. And that corporate entity is distinct from the identity of its individual shareholders. The corporation takes on certain aspects that we would think of as resembling a person. It can enter into contracts, it can sue people, it can be sued. It pays taxes separately from its shareholders. It also outlives its shareholders. Original shareholders of a corporation can die, can sell their shares, and the corporate entity lives on. All of that is important. It's important to see the distinction between the corporate entity and the individual entity of the shareholders for reasons that are obvious if you sort of think it through. If you buy New York Times stock and the New York Times gets sued, you don't get sued. And it's essential that that be the case. So that gives the corporation is the amalgamation of its shareholders, but it is also independent of them. If it goes bankrupt, you don't go bankrupt as a shareholder. You may lose the value of your share, but your personal assets aren't tied into the corporation. So what is the purpose then of this corporate entity? And that, I think, this is not an area that I'm expert in, but let me just say that there's a lot of debate about that. There are those who argue for a kind of corporate responsibility and an ethics of ethical investing or other kinds of sort of good corporate behavior. But I think it's fair to say that most people would agree that the principal, if not the only purpose of a corporation, is to make money for its shareholders. It's to maximize return on investment. And again, it's easy to see why that's the case. If you think about this, sort of in the abstract, some investors may buy New York Times stock, or can't buy Tribune stock, but may buy a stock in a news organization because they want to support the journalism of that organization. But most, frankly, don't. Most are buying stock because they're retirement funds or pension funds or other entities that have a real fiduciary obligation to the people who invest in them to show them some return. So these people, I think it's fair to assume that most people who own stock in media companies don't do it out of some journalistic loyalty. They do it because they're expecting to get a return on their investment. And as a result, the corporation has an obligation to try to do that, to try to serve that interest. Even those corporations that are not publicly traded, Tribune again being one, are driven by many of the same imperatives. The Tribune Company, again, for which I work, has an enormous amount of debt that was taken on in order to purchase the company. It's a large multimedia company. Banks and others hold that debt. They expect to be repaid. So again, there is an essential return on investment component here that really can't be ignored. I mean, you can't. It's easy, and it's very easy if you work in a newsroom to sort of make light of that set of obligations. But the history is littered with the wreckage of the news organizations that didn't take that seriously. The New York Herald Tribune was considered one of the greatest newspapers in this country. The Washington Star, same thing. The LA Herald Examiner here in LA, a very scrappy, well-regarded paper. None of them are fulfilling a journalistic duty today because all of them at some level failed to fulfill a financial duty. They went out of business. And so while, again, it's very easy for someone in my position to want corporations to invest in journalism and to do the right thing journalistically, in the end, if that doesn't serve them financially, it doesn't serve anyone. So there has to be some kind of blending of duties and responsibilities here. That said, I do think it's important to recognize that journalistic companies, entities, are different than other corporations. They do have a different set of obligations because they are obliged not only to serve shareholders, as any corporation is, but also to serve, I would argue, readers and democracy itself. So it is that tension that really undergirds this conversation about the special responsibilities of journalistic companies. So, all right, let me talk a little bit then about the history of the corporation and how it has evolved in American life, and then turn more to media specifically. And again, feel free to interrupt with questions at any point. Again, corporate history is not my specialty, so if you've learned anything different than what I'm about to tell you, assume that where you learned it is probably correct. But I'll tell you this, the earliest corporations date from very early in human history, 500, 600 AD. They developed very slowly for most of that period. There were very few. And then the early, what we would sort of recognize as kind of modern corporations, grow up in about the 15 and 1600s. The East India Company is a well-known early corporate entity. It was specifically chartered by the British government. Most corporate entities in the early life of corporations were specifically chartered by a government to perform a specific duty. So in the case of the East India Company, it was initially, as you would infer from its name, originally created in order to trade with the East Indies. That gradually expanded, and it supervised trade with India, with China, and with all of sort of South Asia. And then ultimately really became an important instrument of British rule. It became in effect almost a government entity, and really was the entity that ruled India for almost 100 years. Flashing forward a little bit to the foundations of this country, the Massachusetts Bay Company was an important part of the development of the early United States. It was chartered in 1629, just 30 years after the East India Company, and its duty was to trade with New England. That's what it had a charter to do. The Puritans, who were involved in founding the Massachusetts Bay Company, also saw it as an opportunity to escape oppression in England and to bring both their business and their lives here to what were then, of course, the colonies. When the American Revolution got underway, the rejection of British rule also entailed a rejection of certain British corporations. The Boston Tea Party, as you'll all recall, the tea that was thrown into the bay that night was East India Company tea. So that early period of American history, there was a lot of wariness of corporate entities, which were seen as really part and parcel of the British Empire that was being thrown off. As a result, at the time of the Declaration of Independence, I read this just a month or so ago, so again, check me on this, but as far as I can tell, there were only 7 corporations actively at work in the American colonies at the time of the Declaration. That was true for much of early American history, when some of the principles that we're really talking about in this class and in journalism generally were struck. Corporations were not highly thought of. It's really not until the industrialization around the time of the Civil War, and particularly just after, that corporations begin to become a significant part of American life. Industrialization, the availability of government contracts, a whole bunch of things contribute to that. But all of that sort of early corporate history reaches a really important moment in 1886 in a case before the Supreme Court known as Santa Clara versus Southern Pacific. I won't give you the long version of this case, but in essence, Santa Clara County here in Northern California wanted $13,366.53, and no, you're not responsible for knowing that number, from the Southern Pacific, which was a rail company here in California, for tax on its rail property that passed through Santa Clara. There was also a related case against another rail company, but and for a different year. But in any event, the whole thing gets fought up to all the way to the United States Supreme Court. And the Southern Pacific's position is that the 14th Amendment, which I've referred to a couple times in this course, which guarantees equal protection to citizens of the United States so that your rights are protected equally no matter what state you live in, that equal protection protected the Southern Pacific from being charged different tax rates depending on where their rail went. The Supreme Court agreed, and that is a really defining moment in the life of corporations in this country, because for the first time the Supreme Court treated a company, a corporation, as a citizen, entitled to a constitutional right, in this case the constitutional right of equal protection. You know, this is a subject for a different course, but it is worth wondering whether that was rightly decided. One consequence is that the 14th Amendment, which was specifically written to protect the rights of freed slaves, became much more successfully used for much of our history in defense of corporations than it did in defense of people. Again, it's probably the subject for a law school seminar, but that's a defining moment in terms of the history that we now confront. And the end of that chain, or at least the end of it so far, was evident in a case that was decided just a few weeks ago by the United States Supreme Court again, and that's the Citizens United case. In Citizens United, the court held that corporations had yet another constitutional right, which is a First Amendment speech right. And I'll read you from the opinion. It says, because speech is an essential mechanism of democracy, it is the means to hold officials accountable to the people, political speech must prevail against laws that would suppress it by design or inadvertence. Now that's a strong defense of free speech, which you could read language like that in a lot of First Amendment cases. What's unusual about this is that all throughout our history, the speech that has been protected has been the speech of people. Now we're talking about the speech of corporations, and specifically their right to speak by spending money. And so in this case, what the court held in a very closely divided case, it was a 5-4 ruling, it concluded that that corporations can spend unlimited sums of money on political campaigns. Now there's still some questions about whether they can contribute directly to candidates, but set that aside for the moment. Mobil Oil could now, if it had an issue on the ballot, or actually to use a livelier example, one of the large banks that might oppose the banking regulations that are being proposed in Congress could spend any amount of money that it could afford to defeat those regulations. It could spend that money to defeat candidates who support those regulations, or to support candidates who oppose those regulations. That is another real sort of benchmark moment in our politics. Now, one thing that has been an issue throughout the Citizens United case, and this entire debate over the sort of right of corporations to speak is media corporations. In the law that the court was examining in Citizens United, there was an exception for media companies. But the court raised the question of how can you distinguish between corporations? Why should the Tribune Corporation or the New York Times Company Corporation, why should they be allowed more speech rights than Exxon or Lehman Brothers or AIG? And it is a fair First Amendment question. If certain corporations, the Tribune Corporation, for instance, can endorse candidates, can spend money to put out a paper that supports Barack Obama or John McCain or anyone it wants, then why shouldn't Exxon be allowed to? The court basically said there are no such constitutionally viable distinctions, but it did so in the course of, which is I think, an utterly defensible point of view, but it did so in the course of doing something else, which is more monumental, which is to say that corporations now have constitutional First Amendment protected rights to speech. So that shows, I hope, how the corporate entity, which really wasn't a significant part of life when the Constitution was written in this country, has now become not only a significant part of our economic lives, it's probably the dominant part of our economic lives, but now is a really significant part of our constitutional life as a country as well, for better or for worse. Okay, the press's history is a somewhat different one, and I've already talked about some of this, so I'll repeat myself a bit, but if the corporation was not a significant part of American life at the founding of the Constitution, the press was. A very different press than we have today, but the press itself, and I'll read to you again the First Amendment, it's my favorite one. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or of the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for redress of grievances. Okay, well that's the foundational set of rights established by the Bill of Rights, and as I have pointed out to you before, the only business that gets named in the Constitution is the press. There is no, I mean, you could imagine, given the history of this country, you could certainly imagine that the framers would have provided special constitutional protections, for instance, for farmers. And there are some land issues dealt with in the Constitution, but there's no specific agricultural discussion in the Constitution. And that's because the fact is that the framers believed the press was special. And there's a quote I came upon recently from James Madison that nicely illustrates that, I think. He says, "Whatever facilitates a general intercourse of sentiments, as good roads, domestic commerce, a free press, and particularly a circulation of newspapers through the entire body of the people, is favorable to liberty." Well, it's a weird collection of things, domestic commerce, good roads, a free press, and particularly a circulation of newspapers. He sees liberty, and he's typical, I think, of the framers, he sees liberty as fundamentally related to the protection of the press. Now, again, he's writing this in a period where the press is not predominantly a corporate press, but now what just to sort of merge these two ideas and then to back up a minute, but now what you have is an institution, the press, that has been, vigorously protected since the beginning of the country, and another institution, the corporation, that has come to be vigorously protected. So now you've got this confluence of two, extremely forceful institutions in American life coming together. Now, it is somewhere, I think it's in Spider-Man, so this is a different kind of reference, but where they said, with great power comes great responsibility, right? If that's true, and Spider-Man is as good a source as any, obviously, this is now a set of institutions that have huge responsibilities, because now we're seeing institutions that are protected, this way and that, for the duty that they perform. It's also, though, important to recognize that none of these protections evolved because the press was so great. I mean, the idea, it isn't as though the framers were working in an environment where you had an utterly responsible and reliable press, and therefore it earned some kind of special protection. Early newspapers in this country were intensely scurrilous and very unscrupulous in the way they went about their business. Alexander Hamilton's affairs and a child out of wedlock, or the fact that he himself was born out of wedlock, were scandalously reported. There were accusations against Washington that got him to the point that he really became fed up with the press by the end of his presidency, against Jefferson for fathering a child with a slave. All of this was part of our national discourse. It was a rowdy discourse, even in those early years. And, as I've mentioned earlier in this course, early presidents did not have a particularly warm relationship with the press. The worst of those acts by a president against the press is probably the Alien and Sedition Acts, which I talked about earlier. That tension has continued throughout our history. And in modern times, there are at least several examples of a really high-level or intense clash between the government and the press. These happen, frankly, all the time, but ones that you'll know about: the Pentagon Papers. The Pentagon Papers were a set of documents written at the Rand Corporation that examined America's involvement in the Vietnam War. They were classified. Daniel Ellsberg, who was one of the authors of them, provided copies to the New York Times, stole a copy and provided it to the New York Times. Later, once the New York Times started to publish it, the government tried to shut down the New York Times from publishing it. The Washington Post then obtained a copy, and they began publishing. Both of them took this all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled that the government could not stop the New York Times or the Washington Post from publishing the papers. That period, that clash between the press and the government in that case, is as high level, as intense a one as you could imagine, and many people believe it was really fundamental in turning public opinion against the Vietnam War. The other sort of vivid example from that period is the reporting by the Washington Post and the Los Angeles Times, and to a lesser degree the New York Times, on the Watergate scandal. Again, a significant threat. Partly what's interesting in both Watergate and the Pentagon Papers, there were significant threats to the businesses of these companies to pursue this kind of reporting. The Washington Post was seeking licenses for some of the TV stations it owned. Government controls that licensing process, so there was danger to the Washington Post business to do that reporting. On an even more personal level, Otis Chandler, then the publisher of the Los Angeles Times, whose family had been very supportive of Richard Nixon throughout most of his life, Richard Nixon ordered Otis's taxes to be audited. I think he also, in one of the tapes, even suggested that they should try to arrest Otis's gardener because they thought he was an illegal immigrant. I mean, this was a nasty personal and business with some real financial ramifications for both these companies and their owners. And frankly, this kind of clash happens all the time. While it doesn't usually have the kind of attention that Watergate or the Pentagon Papers create, local reporting around the country every day is putting newspapers in conflict with their local governments. I can't even count the number of times we have written or published stories that have been critical of the mayor or the police chief or various public officials in this city and county. And those officials have influence over these businesses. These companies like the Los Angeles Times are involved in real estate transactions. They have advertising issues. They have regulatory questions in Sacramento. So the business interests of news organizations and the journalism of the organizations come in conflict regularly. I guess this all leads to the sort of the question of the day, which is what should happen when a history of journalistic service collides with the business interests of journalistic companies. The related questions are who decides what's in the corporation's best interests and what is in the best interest of shareholders. It is common to see, and I'll talk about this in more detail in just a minute, but it's common to see shareholder interest and public interest as fundamentally at odds. I don't think that's always the case, but it really does depend on how you define the question. And so I'll move to that in just a minute. Let me talk about a couple examples that you've read about already or will read about this week. One is in the textbook, and it talks about this tobacco reporting by 60 Minutes. I mentioned it earlier in the course, and it's in the text for this week. The question there is whether CBS Corporate thwarted reporting by reporters from 60 Minutes because CBS corporate interests were not, were not commensurate with critical reporting on tobacco companies. There's some issues of personal relationships between some of the executives at CBS and the tobacco companies, and also there's kind of questions of lawsuits or other, antagonism between them. I will tell you this, I know a little bit more about this case than what is in the text, and I don't think it's as clear an example as the text might let you believe in terms of, it's easy to sort of portray this as purely good guys and bad guys, and that's the movie that we referred to earlier, definitely does that. In the movie, CBS and its lawyers are clearly the bad guys, the journalists are clearly the good guys. There is a legitimate legal issue in the middle of this case, which is that the source who CBS was interviewing and featuring had a contract with one of the tobacco companies, I'm forgetting which one, but it was a non-disclosure agreement. He agreed not to reveal things that he'd learned at work. And if he comes forward on his own to CBS to give this information, he has an issue with the tobacco company, but CBS probably doesn't. The question is whether CBS, by putting him up in a hotel and getting his, buying him nice meals and doing some stuff for his wife, whether they induced him to violate his contract. So there are arguments that the journalists themselves went too far in that case. I don't know. As I say, the text would have you believe that if this went to court, it would be a slam dunk on behalf of the journalists and against the tobacco company. I don't know. But I think it's legitimate to wonder whether CBS, which is a large corporation, which is part of an even larger corporation, whether it saw its interest as a corporation threatened by the reporting that its own journalists were doing. And when that happens, trouble ensues. And at a minimum, CBS put itself in a position to make that a legitimate question about its oversight of these stories. The next example, and we're going to talk about this more on Thursday when my colleague Henry Weinstein will be here to join us, comes from the Staples incident at the Times, at the LA Times. Now, I hope you've all had a chance to read the David Shaw piece on it. The most amazing thing to me about the David Shaw piece is that this whole thing ran in the Los Angeles Times. I mean, it's a gigantic piece. I forget what the word count was. I took up 55 pages on my copier. But let me just briefly recap it, and then I'd be interested in getting your thoughts on it. The Staples incident took place, I want to say 2000, let me see, 1999. 31,000 words, this piece is. That's the better part of a book. It came at a time, well, in retrospect, it seems like a relatively placid time at the Times, given what's happened since. But at the time, it came when what seemed like a very difficult period for the Times. Certainly, the paper was stressed financially. In fact, I'll just read you. There's a nice summary paragraph in it here. It says, the Times' profit margin, stock price, and circulation all had been declining, and Willis, that's Mark Willis, who was then the CEO of the company, felt he had to do something drastic. What he really wanted, he said, was to make the Times bigger, not smaller, bigger and better. He thought he could do that in part by dismantling the wall, and I'll get back to that in a minute, between the editorial and business departments and appointing general managers to help each section of the paper maximize its commercial potential. He was convinced, he said, that greater interdepartmental cooperation and a more focused, aggressive approach to promoting and selling advertising for the paper would bring in new revenues that could be used to hire more reporters and editors and add more space, all with no loss of editorial independence. That's a nice summary of what we refer to as the Willis era, what was going on in that era at the paper. There's a lot of danger in that approach, and yet it's an utterly common sense approach for a normal corporation. You get business units within your corporation to cooperate better, to be more focused on what they're trying to do, and to talk constantly about how to make more money. The problem with that in a news corporation is that a news corporation depends on editorial independence to be viable. And when there's that reference to the wall between editorial and business departments, that's generally been the solution by big, successful newspapers in modern times, is the construction of it's a metaphor, obviously, it's not a literal wall, but the construction of this sort of metaphorical wall between the two sides of the paper. So that I can tell you, happily, that in my entire 20 years at the Los Angeles Times, no person on the advertising side of the paper has ever called me and asked me to write a story that would serve the interests of an advertiser. But you can see why that would be a problem if there weren't that prohibition. It's very hard. If you had, some of the big advertisers for newspapers, grocery stores, department stores, auto dealers, if those people got to make decisions about what went in the paper, there would be very little writing about, you know, E. coli outbreaks in your spinach. You can be sure that Ralph's would just as soon not have that story in the paper. Auto safety, you know, this whole Toyota recall has been a huge story over the last couple months. Again, you have to assume that if Toyota and its dealers had their way, those stories would not run in the newspaper, or at least wouldn't be displayed and you know, presented in the way that they are. So the way that corporations, good news corporations, have tried to deal with that issue is to say to the business people, don't talk to the editorial people. We don't want any appearance of taint at all. Now, of course, they could call and ask for things and the editorial people could say no, but the easier thing to do, rather than put people in a position of having to fight those things out, is just to say you can't talk to each other. Now, that is not to denigrate the ad people. What the ad people do is vital to the business. There is no business without it. And sometimes I think this gets played out in a kind of personal way within news organizations, that the ad people feel like the journalists are contemptuous of them. That shouldn't be the case. The point here is that if they don't talk to each other, then there's no danger of this kind of thing happening. Well, Mark Willis, when he came to the paper, was new to journalism. He had come from General Mills. In fact, he laid off a bunch of people soon after he got there, and thereafter became known as the serial killer, cereal spelled as in breakfast cereal. You know, but he came with a much more sort of conventional corporate model for how these companies ought to be working, which is to say more talk, more interaction, more focus on the bottom line, not less. And the consequence was the Staples episode. What happened there is the Times, you know, as I say, was in a period of financial stress. The Times is in addition to a newspaper, is a major part of the sort of corporate and civic life of Los Angeles. It's got real interest in the development of downtown, owns property downtown. It had an interest in being identified with the Staples Center, which was then, you know, which was foreseen to be a big part of the rebirth of the southern part of downtown, but an important project for the future of LA. The paper didn't have the cash to become a full partner of Staples. Staples was inviting sort of corporate partners. So what was worked out was a deal where the Times would provide certain things to Staples, and Staples would provide certain things to the Times. And one of the things, and it's a little murky even to this day how they reached this decision, but one of the decisions made at some point along the way was that the Times would publish a regular issue of its Sunday magazine. It would devote it to the construction and opening of the Staples Center, and then it would split the profits from that with the owners of the Staples Center. That, to the degree that there is a wall in journalism, that's the end of it. Because that is, now you're saying not only are you going to have communication between advertising and the journalism staff of the paper, but you're going to write about someone and then give them the money that you make for writing about them. So now the business interests of the paper and the journalism interests of the paper have become, you know, inextricably intertwined, at least for that issue of the magazine. Does anyone who's read the piece remember what the publisher's solution to this, how she thought she could avoid, there's another character in all of this named Catherine Downing, who was actually the publisher at the time. She worked for Willis. She had a proposal for how to avoid an ethics conflict in this. Does anyone remember what that is? Yeah.
Didn't she say if she didn't tell the reporters like about the deal that they wouldn't be biased?
That's exactly right. And again, I think you can understand why, for someone kind of new to this business, as she was too, that seemed to her to make sense. How can they write biased pieces about Staples if they don't know that we've entered into the agreement? Anyone want to take a stab at why that doesn't work? Any thoughts? Yeah.
Well, it has nothing to do with that. It's what the public's going to perceive.
Exactly. There's two problems with it. One is just what you've identified, that the issue here is whether the public will perceive this reporting as having been tainted. And the other is she couldn't keep it a secret. It got out. People started to hear about it. Most significantly, the editor of the Times, Michael Parks, heard about it. He heard about it way after the deal had been struck, but before the magazine actually came out. And that, in some ways, that became the most difficult piece of the aftermath of the case. Is it's the classic question in all scandals: what did he know and when did he know it? When it became clear that Parks knew about this issue before it was published, then it became clear to other people, now this is much later, that he should have killed the magazine. And he didn't. He let it go ahead and be published. It was extremely profitable, and it created the largest ethics controversy in the modern history of the LA Times. There was an uproar, and I lived through this, so I can tell you that. People were furious with Downing and with Parks and with Willis. Petitions circulated, there were meetings, people screamed at each other, blah, the whole 9 yards. And again, what was partly distressing about this is that the people on the business side of the paper, many of them did not seem to understand how bad this was. There were people who accused each other of lying, of covering up. But what this episode did was it violated the main device by which journalism has protected itself from its taint, the taint that goes with being part of a company. And that is the separation between the two halves of the operation. Once they merge, it becomes extremely difficult to prove to people that if you're willing to do it for Staples, why aren't you willing to do it for Toyota? If you're willing to do it, for Staples, why not for a grocery advertiser? Now, as it turns out, in the Shaw piece, the David Shaw piece, which you will read if you haven't, there were other instances during that period, smaller, but that raised real questions. And partly what happened with Staples is that all this kind of pent-up irritation and anxiety about what we were doing to erode those two operations then seemed to just explode in this one moment. I want to note, too, in this, that there is an even more modern implication of Staples, and that is it's true that one of the ways newspapers have protected their journalistic integrity is to place this separation between their business and their journalistic interests. That is much less true with most blogging and other web-based news that you might receive. Most web operations are very small, and the person the blogger will often be the person who also takes in the ad revenue. So there is no wall in an operation like that. It's also true that there isn't in some smaller papers, but we have shifted from a kind of ethics paradigm of separating duties to one where you're really left to just trust the ethics of the person who's running one of these operations. If you're reading a blog where the same person is taking the ad revenue as is writing the journalism, you just have to trust that they're not going to be influenced by it. That if the city of Los Angeles takes out an ad on blog XYZ, that blogger won't treat the city of Los Angeles more favorably than if the city of Los Angeles wasn't advertising. If Mayor Villaraigosa takes out ads on a blog to promote his reelection, and his opponent doesn't, you have to trust, and that blogger writes about the election, you have to trust that person's able to take that money and still write critically. Now, this obviously, creates issues. It creates the opportunity for candidates and corporations and others to manipulate that. And as those become more and more dominant news sources for a lot of people, some of the traditions that evolved to protect more traditional journalism will not necessarily protect those organizations. And I think you will be in an environment where it is much harder to know who to trust. Because the fact is that these kinds of compromises happen invisibly, and sometimes even unknowingly to the people involved. It's easy to imagine that people are advertising on your site or in your newspaper because they love your work or they recognize that you're a critical, good writer. Well, in fact, they're really doing it mainly because people read it. And that all those eyes will get attracted to their stuff. So as these distinctions, as journalism organizations change and as new ones come up and take their place, these issues become much more focused and much harder to resolve. Anyone have any thoughts on Staples? As I said, we'll talk about it more on Thursday when Henry's here, but yeah, please.
I don't know, reading that made me so angry how everyone just kept it just seemed like saying, I don't remember euphemism for I don't want to step on anybody's toes. And that it made me angry because here are all these people that are fully aware that the integrity of the newspaper that they worked for is completely in jeopardy from what this happened, and no one's willing to just say, this is what happened, it was wrong, this is when I knew it, and I didn't do anything, and I should have. And it just felt like nobody was willing to really stand up and do that.
Mm-hmm.
And
You get no argument from me.
it just, it was
It was a very frustrating. I think I reread this piece recently. Obviously, it was ravenously read by me and others. In fact, there's a reference in here to the 7 people that went in to talk to Parks at one point. I was actually one of those 7 people. It was exasperating at the time, and reminded me, rereading it, of how exasperating it still is to read. How many people will say that they don't recall such and such being said in a meeting, but don't dispute that it might have been said. For a group of professional journalists, that's pretty slippery language. You know, I will tell you, I think there's, at the end of this piece, there remained a strong sense within the paper that while much was revealed by this piece, that much was not, notwithstanding the fact that it's 31,000 words. No, I don't think in the end we really solved the question of, you know, who was responsible, who was most responsible for this. Catherine Downing, I think, is rightly thought of as the most responsible person in it because she's the one who made this kind of fateful decision not to tell anyone about it. But other people did find out and failed to act. Anybody else? All right, well, let me talk about a still more contemporary example, and that is the Tribune Company today. I say this mindful of the fact that the camera's on, but after 2007, Tribune was no longer a publicly traded company. It was purchased ostensibly by its employees, but really, in fact, by Sam Zell, a real estate magnate from Chicago, a very rich man, who used the employee stock ownership fund to help finance the deal. Now, Sam is, in addition to being, he is now chairman of Tribune. He was for a period there, both chairman and CEO. He is, in addition to that, the head of this large business empire that has made billions of dollars for him and for others. And he has all kinds of other interests. He and, you know, and the company, Equity Partners, that he manages, or he runs. He is politically conservative. He donated to John McCain's campaign. And he has all these other interests, including real estate and rental business. He was said, I don't know if it's still true, but at one time he was said to be the largest renter in the United States, which includes mobile home parks and apartment buildings, et cetera. So in 2008, a year or so after I became editor of the editorial pages of the paper, there was an initiative on the California ballot that would have done several different things. It was called Prop 98. It would have done several different things. It would have strengthened homeowner protection against their land being seized. This goes out, and again, I won't bore you with the whole legal history, but the United States Supreme Court ruled in a case called Kelo, K-E-L-O, that the government had the right to seize property from one property owner and then turn it over to another property owner to be developed in a way commensurate with some public purpose. Very controversial ruling. Actually, in some ways more controversial than it needed to be, because this is actually a more common practice than people know. Yes?
Like eminent domain?
Yes, it's the use of eminent domain, right. And so, you know, what offended people is the idea that the government might be able to go into a poor neighborhood, seize 30 homes, turn it over to a mall developer, have the mall developer develop a mall, make $1 million on it while these homeowners get ousted from their homes. And of course, people are properly unhappy that the government would have the power to do that. On the other hand, throughout, you know, this is what happened. This is why we have Dodger Stadium. This is why we have Staples. I mean, there's been a lot of instances in which the government has used its eminent domain authority and then turned that property over to private developers for development in ways that we don't find terribly controversial today. Nevertheless, it was a controversial decision, and it spawned a lot of ramifications, a lot of reaction, including various ballot measures in California and elsewhere to try to strengthen the right of homeowners to resist eminent domain or limit the authority of government to claim property for private use. No one's really disputing that the government can seize property and pay off the homeowner or whoever for a school or for a highway or whatnot, but for these particular kind of uses. Well, one thing that the sponsors of Prop 98 did, and I think quite self-consciously, is rather than just make it this kind of abstract issue about eminent domain or property seizure, they also, in it, included a provision that said any time that a rent-controlled unit is sold on the open market, that it would be removed from the rent control rolls in California. That was done, I would argue, specifically to get support from real estate interests for the ballot measure. That sweetened the pot for people who opposed rent control or had units that were in rent control. One of those people was Sam Zell, because, as I said, he owns a lot of these properties. So we discovered, someone on the editorial page staff tipped me off early on that if you looked on the donor list, that Sam had given $50,000 in support of Prop 98. Now, I'm sorry, maybe it was Prop 8, Prop 98, in any case. It had given to the proposition. Now, in fairness, $50,000 is not a bundle of money for Sam Zell. Nevertheless, it showed where his allegiance was in this issue. So the question then is, we had to take a position on this issue. I, as editorial page editor, reported to the publisher, who reported to Sam. The question was, would we, A, acknowledge Sam's interest in the issue? B, would we let his interest in the issue affect our position on the issue? I decided that we would take a position utterly irrespective of Sam's, but that we would tell him, that we would let him know what position we were taking, just so he wouldn't find out about it first time in the paper. We took a position to oppose the initiative that he supported, and we disclosed, I can read it to you, it says, you wouldn't know from reading the ballot title and summary that Prop 98 is an anti-rent control measure, but that's become the primary focus of its financial backers, the vast majority of whom are landlords and rental property management companies. One of them is connected to the Times. Sam Zell is chairman and CEO of Tribune Company, which owns the Times. He also chairs Equity Lifestyle Properties, Inc., which donated $50,000 to Prop 98. The company owns 27 mobile home parks in California, many of them subject to rent control. If Prop 98 becomes law, rent-controlled units would become permanently market rate when other tenants leave. In Los Angeles alone, that would affect 62,600 apartments and other rental units. Now, we didn't read him that, but we told him what position we were going to take. No, I say we told him. I didn't talk to him, I'm happy to say. I told the publisher, and I believe the publisher told him. I will say this, despite many of the controversies that have surrounded Zell's ownership of the Tribune Company, never did I hear from him about this. I assumed that he didn't like it, but to his credit, he never expressed that to me. Whether he expressed it to the publisher or not, I don't know. There are a number of other times in which our editorial page, and I assume, by the way, I'm talking about our editorial page because I know about it, but I assume this to be the case at editorial pages around the country. There are a number of other times where the business interests of the company are addressed in editorials, either directly or indirectly. For instance, we, like all news organizations, have a business interest in trying to have records and proceedings, government proceedings, court proceedings, government documents, et cetera, be as open as possible. It facilitates our business. We support that on the editorial page historically, certainly during my tenure there. I would argue not in furtherance of our business interests, but because we happen to believe that open records and open proceedings are good for society generally. So we take a position that is consistent with our business interests, but not because of our business interests. In other cases, we have taken positions that are opposed to our own business interests. California, as you probably know, a few years ago, sharply restricted the kinds of telemarketing that can be done. You can put yourself on a do not call list, et cetera. You can basically shut off most telemarketing to your home. Well, the newspaper industry relies on telemarketing. There are a lot of people cancel subscriptions. A lot of new people move in or change residences. And what we used to do is telemarket them. We used to call them, and that's how we sold them subscriptions. We on the editorial pages before I got there, but supported the efforts in California to restrict telemarketing in direct opposition to our own business interests. Similarly, we have tended to support laws that would protect the right of journalists to protect their sources. What we've argued, and that's consistent with our business interests certainly, but what we've argued is it is good for society to be able to have anonymous sources come forward, and that while that happens to be good for the business of journalism, more importantly, it's good for readers and it's good for society, whether it's the Pentagon Papers or Watergate or anything else, to not squelch that type of reporting. And then the final example I'll just mention in that area is advertising. Billboard advertising, all different types of advertising for different products also benefit newspapers. Newspapers, in addition to running advertising, also advertise. And so we have, for instance, been very supportive of the city of Los Angeles' efforts to curtail billboards, even though that means the Los Angeles Times won't have as easy access to billboards either. So we have more of a mixed record there. Let me just say there, similar to what I said earlier regarding the wall and its importance in separating news coverage from advertising, from the advertising interests of the paper. That's equally true with editorials. We occasionally run advertisements on the editorial page. Usually they're labeled as such unless they're obviously ads. But the procedure there that hopefully protects anyone from trying to do something for an advertiser is I and other people on the editorial pages don't even know who the advertiser is until the ad appears on the dummy of our page. We carried an ad recently for an oil company, I forget which one, but all I knew in laying out the pages is that there was a box that we couldn't put a story in. And I didn't know it until the dummy itself came up and we actually saw it on the page. So one of the ways, again, that we try to protect this is by insulating the two halves of the paper from each other. So all of that is a long way of saying that there is a regular, recurring, and difficult collision between news organizations as information gatherers and disseminators, and news organizations as corporate entities. Sometimes it has historically been resolved well, sometimes obviously less so. Maybe I'll pause there and see if anyone has any thoughts or comments. I'm actually running a little ahead of schedule this morning, so we may finish early today, but anyone want to chime in on any of this? Yes, please.
I'm just curious why magazines don't do that. I remember reading in an article about how the ad people that, putting on these ads, for example, they never want their ads on the pages that have, like in girly magazines where they have, oh, I got raped, 2 weeks ago. It's
Oh, interesting.
Like, they don't want their ad there because of the negative vibes instead. The same
Uh-huh.
thing with like snack foods on like the dieting page.
Mhm.
Like, no one wants to put their whatever gummy bear ad next to
Right.
it. Healthy.
You can see why, yeah.
Those are understandable, but they're still like the article I read said that it was becoming an issue where the ads were dictating.
I don't know the full practices of magazines, but you're absolutely right that the standards of most magazines, in a variety of areas, by the way, are somewhat different than what we'd apply. I know, for instance, that many magazines subjects of stories will negotiate for cover treatment. Celebrities will say that they'll only agree to be featured or agree to an interview if they're promised that they will be on the cover. It's a very common practice in magazines, not an acceptable practice in newspapers. I suspect that the answer to your question really is that, these are traditions that are costly. It costs money to insist on a certain amount of integrity. As I'll say here in conclusion in a moment, I do think that there's benefit to it too. But if you're at a struggling magazine and someone offers to pay you more for the promise that their gummy bear ad will appear, back in the food section and not in the dieting section, then the temptation is always going to be there. There is at least one example I know from newspapers where that's long been the case, which is that I don't know if it's at the request of the advertiser or just by a tradition and a sense of decorum that airline advertising traditionally has never run in the same space as airplane crash stories. And I don't, to be honest with you, I know that was true at the New York Times when I was there more than 20 years ago. I don't know whether that's because it was part of any contractual relationship between the Times or other newspapers and the airlines. I doubt it. I think it's probably more that there's something sort of unseemly about having the death of people next to the ad for American Airlines. But I do know that one issue has long existed in newspapers, and it's sort of like what you're describing. I just don't know whether it's a business transaction or an ethics, sort of taste issue. I'm sorry, there's someone up here. Yes.
Or Sports Illustrated or something like that. Unbiased opinion, just like you
Right.
read from the New York Times, if you're reading the health page on that, then you just have different expectations for the bias.
Yeah, I would be willing to bet, and again, without really knowing, that Time or Newsweek or even Sports Illustrated would take a different approach to that than Glamour, or as you say, that they're presenting to a different kind of information to a different kind of readership, and that may not be completely explicit in the magazine, but it may be sort of understood, and that they feel less obligation to have a kind of high standard of purity on it. Yes.
Yeah, I actually work at a trade publication
Oh, yeah?
magazine, and it's very, they'd say, don't be biased towards the advertisers, but at the same time, like, there is an understanding that, the person who's picking up this publication knows that you are gonna have some sort of bias in the event that, you are just trying to represent that in that trade.
Yeah, I would think this would arise a lot in the context of travel magazines, for instance, that a lot of reviews of hotel, I mean, I assume, actually my brother works for travel magazines, but I'm not taking this from his experience, but I would assume that it's difficult because it's the base of advertiser, the people you're critiquing are almost inevitably going to be your advertising base, and how they finesse that, I don't know, but yeah, I just suspect your experience is right on the money, yes, so to speak.
Television journalism, if they don't have as much of a wall as print journalism, because I remember reading for some other class about a situation where I think it was ABC was gonna broadcast a story about like migrant farm workers or something like that, and Coca-Cola had an issue with it and like refused to air an ad. If they broadcast the story, so they cut it.
Oh, so they cut the story? That's a bad call, yeah. I mean, listen, this kind of issue arises in all media with some frequency, you know? I mean, again, I don't know it, so it's easy for me to speculate, but I would be dumbfounded to discover that if it were the case that Toyota was not reconsidering its advertising in certain publications these days in light of the coverage of this recall stuff. For the most part, and I happen to know of instances in the past where advertisers have pulled advertising from the LA Times because they were upset about one kind of coverage or another. You know, in general, the proper response to that is to say to advertisers, you're not advertising in our paper because you like us. You're advertising in our paper because 1 million people a day read it. And therefore, we're going to, in order for those people to want to read it, we have to be able to say to them that we're not tuning our coverage to your interests. And so it's in your interest for us to be well regarded. That's the, again, I don't sit in on those conversations, but that's to me, the essential corporate and ethical response to the advertiser who tries to throw their weight around is to say, we're not doing this because we're friends. We're doing this because we have a common business interest. And perversely, it's actually in the advertiser's interest to have the paper or the news organization be seen as being strong enough to write critically about its own advertisers. Now that's a kind of a mindfuck, but you know, carried out correctly, it does serve everyone's interests. Yes.
I always find it interesting when you flip through a magazine and you see an advertisement that initially doesn't look like an advertisement, because I'm usually tricked and I'll start reading it. It's in the same format, and then when you look to the top, usually it'll say clearly advertisement at the top of the page, but some readers aren't, you know, that astute, or they don't clearly see that. So, I mean, sometimes I'll start reading it, or on TV there's these like flashing, almost news-like broadcasts that are for, I don't know, like a weight loss supplement or an insurance company, where the bottom has like a ticker going across, and it really is an advertisement. It'll say like, you know, this is an advertisement.
Right. That comes up, again, with some frequency in newspapers as well. It is, you know, one of the things that you can always tell if you've got a problem on your hands is if an advertiser resists putting the word advertisement over their ad, that's when you should do it. Because that means they're trying to fool people into thinking it's not an advertisement. I didn't bring a copy of today's paper, and I don't know if there would be one in there today. But, you know, some ads are, you know, transparently ads. I mean, this ExxonMobil piece across the bottom of today's New York Times, it's, you know, you can tell typographically and in every other way. It's not done in Times newsprint. It's not done in Times typefaces, et cetera. So you can see that it's an ad. It would seem just redundant to label that an ad. But, you know, as newspapers become sort of more colorful and more graphically sophisticated or light and cheesy, depending on your point of view, sometimes it's harder to tell. I'm just thumbing through this one to see if there's one today. I don't see anything that's labeled ad, but I also don't see anything that would confuse me. You know, we had an issue on the editorial pages a while back with just that, with an advertiser who did a buy, not just in the Times, but Tribune-wide, and basically part of the deal was that they wanted all the papers to carry it and none of them to label it an ad. You know, it was close, and actually we didn't run it the first day because we were concerned about it, and then it happened that the ad ran on that same day on the New York Times op-ed page without the word ad, and then so the next day we just knuckled under and ran it. And as I say, it was one, actually sometimes the answer to these, and this is sort of down in the weeds more than you need to know, but sometimes the answer is just layout. What happened in that instance, for instance, is our page is laid out, you know, different ways, different days, and this is what the op-ed page would look like for us normally too. The day this ad that I'm referring to happened to be about the shape of this one, and the day that we ended up holding it, the page had been laid out in 4 chunks. So there was an op-ed piece here, one here, and the ad here. And I was concerned that the nature of the layout made it look like 4 pieces. When we ended up running it the next day, we did a layout more like this one, so there was text wrapped around it in a way that it stood out more. So sometimes you can resort to, you know, sort of particular devices that just help emphasize that something is different. In every instance, the goal should be not to deceive people and to not to have the experience that you're describing, which is of not being sure whether you're seeing something that's news or something that's advertising. One other thing to mention in the course of advertising is that newspapers are liable for the content of ads in just the way, or almost exactly the same way that they are for other coverage. You know, so that the case, if you're going to read in a couple of weeks, New York Times versus Sullivan, which is the fundamental foundational case in the case of libel, actually arose out of an ad that ran in the New York Times, not out of a news story or an editorial that ran in the New York Times. So one of the other complications is that the content of ads subjects newspapers to the same kinds of liabilities that news coverage does, even though newspapers don't write them themselves usually. Any other thoughts? All right, well, let me just offer a couple concluding thoughts then. What did I do with my concluding page here? Sorry, that would be silly if I lost it. Oh, here we go. I guess what I would just say by way of emphasis is just to reiterate that news organizations are, in most instances, corporations, but they are not like most other corporations in terms of their duties. That there are special obligations to the public that go with running a news organization. You know, that I would, again, by way of reiterating, just note that the vitality of news coverage is a far older, far more important tradition in this country than the place of corporations in its life. And that the constitutional, legal, social compact that the press has with the public and the government predates its existence as a set of corporations. And even though the corporation has come on strong as a sort of, you know, formative part of our life today, it's important to remember that these press obligations and privileges predate that history. And in doing that, I mean, I would just, I've tried most of the way along in this course not to sort of preach, but indulge me for a moment. Which is to say, I think that there is a fundamental misconception that happens in many news organizations, and has happened at mine, frankly, on occasion, which is to misunderstand what the interests of news corporation shareholders are. That their interests are not necessarily served by what is cheapest or most expedient in the short run. That the news organization that deadens out its reporting, that caves into advertisers, that produces shallow and non-probing reporting or news, ultimately, yes, it fails to perform a constitutional duty, but ultimately it fails to perform a shareholder duty too, which is that a news organization that doesn't do those things is a toothless one. And a toothless press ultimately is an irrelevant press, and an irrelevant press ultimately is not a profitable press. So I do think that there is a way to harmonize the ethics of journalism and the ethics of the corporation. And that is to recognize that investment in journalism and protection of journalism and even the nurturing of journalism are ultimately in the interests of the journalistic corporation too. So yes, yeah, and I can't even tell you the number of times I've had this conversation, but with colleagues and people who run the business of my business and other journalism businesses, yes, it is expensive to do journalism, but it is easy to misunderstand what the cost benefit of that is. It's very fashionable among business side news executives to say, what's the corporate value? What's the shareholder value of a Pulitzer Prize? Well, the shareholder value of a Pulitzer Prize is it associates in the minds of readers the journalism of that news organization with excellence. And they are more inclined to take it seriously, and therefore they're more inclined to read it and care about it, and therefore, if they're more likely to read it, then the company prospers as well. there are news corporations that have chosen to ignore or deny or defy those kinds of mandates. I will say to you, it is my view that that is engaging in profoundly unethical behavior, corporate and journalistically unethical behavior, and that the organizations that do that consistently deserve what they're getting, which is that they deserve to diminish and ultimately to disappear. But the ones that stand fast, whether it's out of a commitment to ethics in journalism, a commitment to the Constitution, or a commitment to shareholder value, all ought to end up in the same place, which is in defense of expensive but important journalism. Ultimately, I think that serves the interests of everyone. Now, on Thursday, you'll hear from a former colleague of mine who believes these things, if possible, even more strongly than I do. His name is Henry Weinstein. He is one of the great reporters in the history of the LA Times. He recently left to teach at UC Irvine, but he'll be here on Thursday, and so he and I will just have a conversation about some of these issues. Please come prepared to ask him questions, and I'll see you then. Thank you.